بر محمد والے محمد صلوات
اللہم صلی علی محمد والے محمد
ارے بھائی کے سوگوارو الوداع آخری منزل سے
یارو الوداع
آخری منزل سے
یارو الوداع
خاتمہ بالخیر چہلم کا ہوا الوداع
اشک بارو الوداع
الوداع اشک
بارو الوداع
اکبر و اصغر علی کی ضامنی نوجوانوں
شیرخوارو الوداع
نوجوانوں شیرخوارو
الوداع
کہتے تھے گنجے شہیداں پر حرام فاطمہ
زہرا کے پیارو الوداع
فاطمہ زہرا کے
پیارو الوداع
کربلا کی خاک کو سونپا تمہیں عرش اعظم
کے ستارو الوداع
عرش اعظم کے ستارو
الوداع
خبر پر بیٹوں کی زینب نے کہا ماں وطن
جاتی ہے پیارو الوداع
ماں وطن جاتی ہے
پیارو الوداع
دست سونا پاس بستی بھی نہیں بے دیارو بے
مزارو الوداع
بے دیارو بے
الوداع
خبر سے آواز دیتے ہیں حسین لو بہن
زینب سدھارو
لو بہن زینب
سدھارو الوداع
اور بھائی کے سوگوارو
درود بھیجیے محمد والے محمد
اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد
چہلوم جو کربلا میں 72 کا ہو چکا پیوند بے کسوں کے تنو سر کا ہو چکا اور فاتح حسین کے لشکر کا ہو خبروں پہ شور آلے پیمبر کا خبروں پہ شور آلے پیمبر کا ہو چکا ماتم میں 3 روز رہے شور و شین سے روئے لپا کے مزار حسین روئے لپٹ کے مزار حسین مثل چراغ گورے غریباں پہ دل جلائے پھولوں کے بدلے قبروں پر لختے جگر چڑھائے پیاروں کی بود و باش کے سامان جو یاد بے ساختہ پکارے کلیجے پکڑ بے ساختہ پکارے کلیجے پکڑ ہے وہ پردہ دار ہمارے کدھر گئے بے پردہ ہو کے آلے نبی در بدر گئے مقتل کے آس پاس یہ بیووں کی تھی فغا زینب جب لحد پہ دھرے کرتی ہے زینب جب ہی لحد پہ دھرے کرتی اے میرے کربلائی برات حسین ہمشیر 3 دن سے تمہاری ہے ہمشیر 3 دن سے تمہاری ہے اللہ میری بات بھی پوچھی نا آپ نے زندہ کی واردات بھی پوچھی نا آپ نے راضی ہوں جو رضائے امام جلیل ہے پر قابل ملاحظہ بازو کے پر قابل ملاحظہ بازو نئے کوئی داغ حسن ہے کوئی کفیل بھائی بغیر آپ کے زینب بھائی بغیر آپ کے زینب ذلیل ہے پشتو پناہ اٹھ گیا بے قانما ہوئی دیکھو یہ پشت قابل نو کے سنا ہوئی میں جانتی تھی شہر بسا ہوگا بھائی کا ہوگا خبر پہ ساری خدا ہوگا ہجوم خبر پہ ساری خدا چہلم کروں گی دھوم سے میں کربلا پرسا بھی یہاں کوئی نہیں زہرا کی پرسا بھی یہاں نہیں کوئی زہرا کی منہ ڈھانپنے کو آپ ہی پلہ بھی لیتی ہوں اور اپنے دل کو آپ ہی پرسا بھی دیتی ہوں چہلم تو کر چکی میں دل افگار یا حسین اب روزہ کس طرح سے ہو تیار اب روزہ کس طرح سے ہو تیار بیٹا بھی اور بہن بھی ہے نادار یا آخر کبھی تو آئیں گے آخر کبھی تو آئیں گے زبان تکیہ ہے کار سازیے پروردگار پر اس دم تو صاحباں بھی نہیں ہے مزار پر زینب پکاری کوچ کا سامان ہو گیا پھر شہر بھائی کا ویران پھر شہر میرے بھائی کا ویران اور مقبرہ حسین کا سنسان ہو گئے ہو کا مقام قتل کا میدان ہو کا مقام قتل کا میدان ہو گیا آئی مسافروں کو میرے وہ زمیں پسند دنیا میں جس زمیں کو بستی نہیں پسند اے کربلائے سرورے دلگیر الوداع اے قتل حضرت شبیر اے قتل گائے حضرت شبیر اے قبر ابن صاحب تطہیر اے بھائی جان جاتی ہے اے بھائی جان جاتی ہے کیا بے نصیب ہے یہ نواسی رسول کی تم نے مجاورینہ ہماری قبول کی بھیا اٹھو کجاوے میں مجھ کو تم ہی بٹھاؤ بھیا میں بے نقاب رگر بھیا میں بے نقاب رگر رو کے قناعت اکبر و عباس کو خالی ہے گود بھابھی کی اصغر خالی ہے گود بھابھی کی اصغر کو لے کے آ سردار سارے قافلے کے آگے ہوتے ہیں تیار کارواں ہوا اور آپ سوتے ہیں کب سے تمہیں پکار رہی ہوں میں قصدتاً ہے جواب بھی نہیں دیتے ہے جواب بھی نہیں دیتے بھیا گلے لگا لو تو جاؤں سوئے وقت آئی ندا سے دارو خدا حافظ آئی ندا سے دارو خدا حافظ صغرا کو میری سمت سے بھی پیار کی جیو ہوگا خاطر بیمار کی جیو ہوگا ثواب خاطر بیمار کی جیو
The next Majalis series here at IEC will be from Wednesday, September 21st to September 25th. These Majalis are going to be addressed by Allama Sayyid Muntazir Mehdi Rizvi, resident of Qom, Iran. These Majalis will be addressed in Urdu. Tonight Majlis will conclude this Arba'in series with our guest speaker, Dr. Sayyid Shabbir Kirmani from Orlando, Florida. Once again, on behalf of IEC community and IEC board, I would like to extend our sincere and deepest gratitude and appreciation to Dr. Kirmani for accepting our invitation and making himself available for this series. And we also pray that may Allah, for the sake of 14 Masumin, grant him more strength and energy to serve the community across the world and continue to bless him with good faith, knowledge, and health. For Dr. Kirmani's health, his service to our community, his time and effort, please recite aloud salawat. I would humbly request everybody who's sitting in the back and by the wall, please come forward as much as you can around the member so we can have the mahal for the majlis. With a loud salawat, please come from. Oh, my. And now humbly request Dr. Kirmani to the member to conclude this series. For Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل سيروا في الأرض صدق الله العلي العظيم زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد We've been discussing the future of our community, and therefore the question I begin with is, what is the future of our community in the 21st century? What is the future of Islam in the 21st century? What is the future of Shiaism in the 21st century. And we've discussed a few things in the last few nights. Inshallah, we'll culminate this conversation tonight, inshallah. But my hope is this is not where the conversation ends, this is where the conversation begins. And that is, a discussion should perhaps ensue amongst you all to see what it is that we can do to chart the future of our community. And in that regard, this community, along with a few communities in which I lectured, were strategically picked in order for this message to be set forth. If you know the history of America, you know that things often go from the coasts or some of the major cities inward. So oftentimes you will have the likes of New York and Los Angeles and the likes, and then Chicago, and then things will move towards the interior. And so the idea is, it may be an idea whose time has come. And I know many of you have said to me here and elsewhere that, you know, we had been having some of these thoughts for years, and we've just never heard them here. We just never heard them on the mimbar, and we didn't know that this could be actually expressed from the mimbar. And I've heard in all of these travels that people said, I've heard this line over and over again, that I wish this was said 20 years ago, or I wish this was said 25 years ago. And people said, if it was said 25 years ago, maybe my son would still be around in the community. Maybe my daughter would still be around in the community, but nobody said it at that time. So I lost my son or daughter, and they don't come anymore. And this is why I thought it was time to perhaps say these things. Otherwise, I don't want for another parent to have to say, I wish my child was still around. Therefore, it's a tremendous honor for me to be here, and I cannot be anything but grateful to this community for its hospitality, as well as its love for the Ahlul Bayt, which you see. You've had a long day. I'm not trying to take any more of your time, but we have some messages to give. Tonight is the commemoration of Imam al-Hussein predominantly. That's what the majority should be and will be, inshallah. But a few messages that I need to get to you before that, and inshallah we will try to share those, and from there we'll inshallah build on where we are going. The first point that I want to look at is, what is the culmination of this conversation? Where do we leave off, and what do we take it from here? Number one. Number two, with respect to that, what is this notion of cross-pollination? And what does it mean to cross-pollinate ideas, and how can those be beneficial? What is the story and the history of those people who ventured out of the cave, saw something, learned something, and then came back? What is their example, and what can we learn from them in the Islamic framework? What is the Shia American identity, American Shia identity, and how vital and how important is that in terms of trying to succeed in life? And finally, how does this all relate to the movement of Imam Hussein? And how is it that Imam Hussein alayhi salam gives us confidence to be able to take the long road, the hard road, the difficult road, but still achieve success? And how is it that some of the attributes of the Ahlul Bayt are so universal, but we may not have reflected on them, we may not have thought of them? And how is it that we can embody them? And finally, of course, tonight being that night, what is that journey back to Medina? The journey of Arba'een via Karbala, and that is what we'll inshallah commemorate tonight. This is our agenda for the brief moments we are together. Wherever you are, here in Chicago or across the globe, from the bottom of your heart, send a salawat on Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. At the first level, if you go to Florence in Italy, I've been there, I'm sure many of you have been there as well. There was a moment in time, I think there's some residents, Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. If you go to Florence, you will find that there's much artwork there, the works of Michelangelo and the likes of Leonardo da Vinci and others. And this is interesting because this was a city that was built by a family in particular called the Medici family. The Medici family were the bankers of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church historically was the biggest opposition against usury or interest or bribe, for example, this loan sharking. So they were adamantly against it. They said the Bible is against it, you cannot do it. And so when they realized how profitable it was, when they realized this, they said, look, we have to utilize this avenue and benefit from it. And at that point in time, they became the biggest bank in the world, and the people who were their bankers were the Medici family. The Medici family was in Florence, and they patronized and they brought some of the best intellectual talent in the world to Florence. They brought architects and lawyers and doctors and thinkers and artists, and you name it, everyone flocked there. And what happened as a result, a flourishing of ideas happened in that space, and things came out of there that you would not imagine, for example. One of the artworks that's famous in Florence is a statue by the name of David. Now sometimes we see this, you may go there for a holiday or something like that and you'll see it, but you don't think about the philosophy behind it. Art is supposed to have and does have a philosophy behind it, but many of us don't realize it. And sometimes it doesn't even have a philosophy, or there's something else behind the scenes. Allow me to explain. Do you know why the Mona Lisa is famous as an artwork? The one by Leonardo da Vinci that's in the Louvre in Paris? Well, I went there and I asked them. They didn't have an answer. And there's something that is very interesting about it, that you will find there's something called the Mona Lisa effect. The Mona Lisa effect says that if something is in your periphery and something's in front of you, you start valuing it more. Example, until 1911, the Mona Lisa painting was not known amongst people except for one or two art experts. In 1911, it was stolen. When it was stolen, after 24 hours, someone realized it was stolen and they reported it stolen. So what happened was, for 1 year, 2 years, people followed the news about the Mona Lisa and they said, where is this painting? And everyone's saying it's not being found. Eventually, after 2 years, when it was found, the news of the era said, and the Times said, look, we found the Mona Lisa, it's back. And when it was back, everyone flocked to see it. This also happens in the stock market and other things. People always talk about a particular stock, it will have the Mona Lisa effect. Why am I explaining this to you? Come back to David. David has a symbolic importance about it. It's done by Michelangelo. It's a large structured stone statue. I have a point. I hope I'm not wasting your time. Stay with me. It was based on the biblical story, which we also accept in the Quran as well, from the story of Dawood. Dawood, that same David, is the symbolic importance. In the Quran, we are told of Dawood and we are told of two individuals, Jalut and Talut in the Quran. Jalut refers to Goliath, David and Goliath. Talut is that individual who the Banu Israel asked, and they said, give us a ruler that will be successful over us, give us a king over us. And Allah gave, in the Bible, the name is King Saul. In the Quran, the name is Talut. These individuals were appointed. And Allah said, we appointed Talut as a ruler over you because he was bastatan fil ilmi wal jism, that he was superior to you in knowledge and in body. Now body could mean courage, resilience, strength, many things. Now if I say that Ali ibn Abi Talib after Rasulullah was the highest level, don't complain, because the Quran said the criteria for leadership is bastatan fil ilmi wal jism, and nobody can deny in terms of knowledge Ali ibn Abi Talib was the first, and nobody can deny in terms of the courage of Ali ibn Abi Talib, nobody was superior to Ali ibn Abi Talib. So the Quranic principle is there. Now coming back to this, David and Goliath is known as a very historic story within the Bible, and the idea is David is small and on the other side is Goliath, this large, big, massive presence. And when it came, who's going to fight this person? Nobody came forward. David, who's young, Dawood at that time was young, he comes forward and he fights. And he takes what we call a slingshot, and he defeats Goliath with his intelligence and smarts. The symbolic importance was that we're going to build a statue of David, Florence, because Florence was not the biggest city, it was a smaller city. And other cities are going to try to come and conquer Florence, and it was to say that we have the strength intellectually to win this battle. The strategy to win this battle. The same way I mentioned Hannibal the other night. So there was a symbolic point, but the idea that I wanted to share with you was the cross-pollination of ideas. And when ideas cross-pollinate, you understand that you come to new conclusions. First example. Second example. I was in London lecturing, and after I mentioned this idea of cross-pollination of ideas, one of the brothers said, say that you mentioned something and I need to share this with you. I said, what is it? He said, my sister went to Cambridge University. I'm sure you know Cambridge, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Princeton. These are some of the renowned universities of the world. He said when she went to Cambridge, one of the secrets that's known amongst people who go to Cambridge is that the people who go to Cambridge, every night for dinner, for supper, they get together within their colleges and they talk and they discuss their research and what they're looking at. So you have people who are historians, people who are physicists, people who are X, Y, and Z, and they are all discussing and talking to one another. And when they talk, they lead to and come up with new ideas and new conclusions that other people did not come. That's why they have all these Nobel laureates and Nobel Prize winners that people did not consider before and people did not know before. So this is the second example of the cross-pollination of ideas. Now remember two things if you remember nothing else. We're trying to chart and learn from history to figure out how can we chart the future. And one element of that is to be able to seek, are we seeking truth or are we seeking that thing which was our own belief and validating it. Today, we know there's this notion of unconscious bias, that whatever I say, this notion that I may have biases that I don't even realize, and they influence how I see things, how I look at things, how I absorb things, how I reject things. And if we're not aware, then we may be susceptible to that. Look, the path that we're embarking on is a difficult journey. And I want you to think about this, because what lessons would you teach your children, your next generation? And in speaking with some of the most successful and most accomplished religiously and what we call secularly accomplished in our community, one of the most important traits in life is to be able to conquer fear. Most people, they don't live the life they are able to live because of fear. Fear holds you back. Fear keeps you away from achieving the goal. But if we learn anything from Imam Amir al-Mu'minin, if we learn anything from Imam Hussein, if we learn anything from Karbala, if we learn anything from the Imams, it is to be able to conquer fear. I remind you, Teddy Roosevelt, the person who was the president of the United States during World War I, you'll notice that leaders, they've had difficulties in their life. That's a trend, and then they overcome it and they help to lead other people. Teddy Roosevelt, there's a book called Leadership in Turbulence Times. I recommend you read it. It talks about Lincoln and Roosevelt and many other people. Anyways, the idea within this is that he lost his mother and his wife on the same day. His wife was delivering, and his mother was coming, and she caught fever, and in the delivery his wife died. Both of them died on the same day. He had to go in isolation and recuperate for 1 year, and then he came back. And he says after that he came back stronger, but it was very difficult. Now stay with me here. At this point in time, Roosevelt gives a speech at the University of Paris, which is called the Sorbonne. And in that speech, it's called Citizenship in a Republic. In that, there is one paragraph that is called The Man in the Arena. I have it on my wall. I recommend you also read it. And in that, he says a line, which I want you to never forget. He says, look, the credit does not belong to the one who is standing and sitting in the stands and pointing the finger at the one who is on the arena, in the arena, on the court, in the court. The credit does not belong to that person. The credit belongs to the one who is on the arena, in the arena, who has their face marred with blood and sweat and toil because they're trying and they're daring greatly. That is the essence of understanding. When you understand this analogy of gladiators, when you understand this analogy of sports today, there are certain people who are on the court. There are certain people who are in the arena. There are certain people who are in the maidan. And there are certain people who are just watching. And remember, the ones who are watching are talking. The ones who are talking amongst themselves. They're saying this and that and the other. But remember, the person who's on the court does not have the time to listen to the people who are talking. They can't even hear them. The tickets that you pay for Cubs games and Bears games and things of that nature, you can be shouting at the top of your lungs. Hardly they'll ever hear you on that field. Everyone's trying to get as close as possible. In life, always be on the court. It's difficult, but remember, Rasulullah was on the court, Imam Ali was on the court, Imam Hussein was on the court. They were not spectators. They were not sitting in the stands. And this is every imam, whether they were writing or giving du'as or whatever it was, they were doing something. They were in a state of movement at every time. Sometimes we understand, sometimes we don't. So principle number one, understand that conquering fear is vital to be successful in this dunya and in that dunya, both of them, number one. And fear will hold you back. What was the first thing that the verse that I've been reciting of Surah Baqarah 155? وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَوْفِ. First thing is khawf, fear. That's what we're going to be tested with. First principle. Second principle is the story of Luqman, and I want you to never forget it. And that is this. Luqman was one of the wisest people. Luqman al-Hakim, the Quran says, and the Ahlul Bayt say, tell us. The stories of Luqman are immense. One story I want to share with you. Luqman embarks on a journey with his son. And he says, I want to teach my son a lesson. How do I teach him this lesson? He says, my son, let's go on a journey. So Luqman goes with his son and they go to travel. It's Luqman, his son, and they have one mule, one animal that they're to ride. So at this point in time, Luqman says, my son, there's the mule here and we have our stuff, our things. You sit on the mule and I will walk and we'll go. So they go for a little bit on their journey towards the desert, and they're going on their journey, and a few moments pass, they pass by a crowd. When they pass by a crowd, the crowd looks at them, they see Luqman's son sitting on the mule, and they see the father walking, and they see this animal, and they say, what a terrible son. He has no respect for his father. He has no dignity for his father. He has no respect for his father. He is sitting comfortably on the mule, and the father is walking in the desert. Luqman looks at his son and he says, my son, did you hear them? He said, yes, Baba, I heard them. They went a little bit further. Then they said, look, let's swap. So Luqman sat on the mule and his son got down. They went a little bit further. They went by a new town. They saw other people. Other people saw that. They looked at the situation. They looked at Luqman sitting on the mule. They saw the son. And they said, look, they said, what kind of father is this? He has no humanity, he has no love, he has no compassion for his son. His son is walking in the desert and he's sitting on the mule, comfortably, easy. Luqman looks at his son. He said, my son, did you hear them? He said, yes, Baba, I heard them. So he got down and they proceeded. When they proceeded a little bit further, eventually they got a little bit further. Eventually they went further and they got to a new town. When they got to a new town, so now it's Luqman and his son walking and the mule is empty. The people begin to laugh, this new town. So what kind of father and son are these? They have a perfectly good mule and both of them are walking next to the mule, useless. No, they're not using it. They're laughing. Luqman looks and says, look, my son, did you hear them? He said, yes, Baba, I heard them. Very good. So then he said, let's do something. Both of them got onto the mule and they went to the next destination. They're going on their journey. They're both sitting on the mule. They get to the next village. What happens? Exactly as you thought. Animal rights. What happened to this? Two father, son, they're sitting on this poor mule. Has anyone thought about this mule? Luqman says, my son, did you see and hear what they said? He said, yes, Baba. He went a little further. They got down. They got by the river. They got to their destination. He said, my son, I wanted to teach you something. He said, Baba, what did you want to teach me? He said, I wanted to teach you one thing. That you will try to please the people, but you will never be able to please the people. You can try as much as you want, but life, you will never be able to please people. So he says, do one thing in life. Just try to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. That's it. There's no one else. That Allah, tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I did this for you. This was Imam Hussain alayhi salam. What does the poet says? Have we ever talked about the love dimension of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam? His love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the aspect of our love for our creator, the way that we should have for Imam Hussain. The poet, by the way, this poet says, I wrote this line in honor of Imam Hussain. He wrote a whole line, a whole poem in honor of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And he himself says that this line was with respect to Imam al-Hussain. So I'm not saying it. So who was the poet? The poet was Ahmad Faraz. Now you may say, Ahmad Faraz, what did he say about Imam Hussain alayhi salam? But we should not judge people. We should just take the poetry as it is and see maybe people have something in their heart, in their aqidah. And we may understand it. हर्फ़ ताज़ा की तरह क़िस्सा पारी ना कहूँ, कल की तारीख़ को मैं आज का आईना कहूँ, और इश्क़ की राह में जो कोहे गरां आता है, इश्क़ की राह में जो कोहे गरां आता है, लोग दीवार कहें, मैं तो इसे ज़ीना कहूँ. This idea that we say about Imam Hussain alayhi salam, that oh, he went through all these difficulties. But did you see that we were saying that this is difficulty, this is that. But Imam was saying, no. This is not a Kohe Garan. This is not this big mountain. This is a staircase. This is a ladder to the divine, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do we ever look at Imam Hussain alayhi salam from that lens? What was his love for Imam Hussain, for Allah? What was Imam Hussein's love for Allah? If you want a triple PhD in Islam, get in your circles, get with your families, and just analyze Dua Arafah of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. That is a triple PhD in Islam. And it will take a lifetime to understand. And perhaps you won't understand, I won't understand it. But at least we'll get 1 inch or 1 millimeter closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember always, the goal of all of the Imams was one, to take our hands and give us a first class ticket to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why we follow them. They are our means, our zarya to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes in our communities we have not clarified this to the point that people understand. If you ask the elder generation, when you say Ali, when you say Rasulullah, when you say Hussain, it's not disconnected from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for the next generation, oftentimes these things have not been clarified. I need to share with you my story, so I explain where I'm coming from. Because this is the story of what is breaking my heart, and I'm seeing people who are leaving our faith because we're not learning the lessons from history. My grandfather came to this country in 1946 from India. There was no Pakistan at the time. And he came to study in Ithaca, New York, upstate New York. When he came to study, the African American community would ask him at a rest stop that, do you see that sign over there? He said, yeah. So the sign said, at this rest stop, no dogs or blacks allowed. He said, do you see the sign? He said, yes. He said, we can't come to this restaurant. Can you please buy us something, like a sandwich or something? Because he was not neither white nor he was black. He was someone who was a student. And so he said, sure. And he would help them in that regard. I'm telling you the story of Islam in America and Shiaism in America. You know, it's a long history. I don't know if you know, on the Titanic, there were 3 documented Shia sisters who were coming to America. This is the history of America, I'm telling you. So at that point in time, eventually, you know, he had his journey, and then I had an uncle, and I'm telling you because this relates to your stories too. Some people came in the 40s, some people came in the 50s, some people came in the 60s. So then I had an uncle who came on the West Coast in 61. And then after that, he had a brother who came in 64. And then I had my uncles who came in the 70s on the East Coast in Maryland and DC. I say this because there were things that happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that we should learn from by now. And we haven't learned from. I'm 32 now. I was 4, 5, 6 years old when your alim here, may Allah bless him, he did a great service, and we have a big burden to repay ulama like this, Mehboob Mehdi Rizvi Qibla. He was very young. He's still, mashallah, very young. He was very young at that time, to the point you can ask him, he used to wear glasses to look older because he was that young at the time. I was 4 or 5 years old. He used to come to the Shabbir in Maryland, and we used to go to the Shabbir, and we used to listen, and it was an amazing time. You had Sache Bhai, you had some of the great Zia Bhai, and all of these. I mean, we called them uncle, but people know them as Bhai. So we listened to them. We'd spend the whole night listening to Majalis and doing Noha, and there used to be Zanjir Zani on Ashura, and all of these things used to happen. And what we realized was some people went other ways and other places. And that point that I was saying the other night of necessary but not sufficient, that's what happened. That aza and azadari is necessary, there's no doubt about it. But people had the assumption that that in itself will be enough. And when people got to college, when people got to university, they had a rude awakening. I have to deal with the parents who email me and text me, said, my son was azadar, matami, he did zanjir, he did everything. I sent him to med school for 4 years, for undergrad 4 years, then med school 4 years, then residency 3 years. Now I say, beta, come to Majlis. I said, Baba, Mama, I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is nonsense. I have to deal with those emails. I have to deal with those calls. I have to deal with those situations where people are saying, my child is highly educated now, but they don't want to see or speak of the Imam Barga, the Husainiya, the Jamaat. They don't want to have anything to do with it. So I'm trying to have a conversation with you to save our next generation. And the path that I'm on is very difficult. And the reason is you make enemies on both sides. You make enemies on the sides of the people who say that you speak out against the ulama and the scholars, when I have the utmost respect for the ulama and scholars. And you make enemies on the people on the other side with people who are saying you're against azadari. You have no friends. That's why Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen said, adherence to justice has left me without any friends. Amir al-Mu'mineen said that. So if you are liked by everyone and loved by anyone, the Ahlul Bayt tells us that's the number one munafiq. That's the number one hypocrite. So the question is, with respect to the future of our generations, are we following the Alawi principles or the Muawiyah principles? And that's the tough, bitter pill that no one is willing to take on. And I'm trying to have this conversation in Chicago and DC and New York and Los Angeles and Florida and Seattle and Texas, so that we start a conversation to save our next generation. I cannot tell you how many friends of mine, as soon as they hit college and med school, people who I did matam with standing next to one another, they stopped coming. And I tried so hard. And believe me, when I was trying in the early phases, when I was trying to push for English majalis, not because, by the way, I challenge you to find someone who's born and raised here who understands Anis and Dabir the way I do, perhaps. My whole life has been here. I'm telling you this because if you don't understand this, I'm telling you the writing on the wall. And it breaks my heart that we have not learned from those people who came in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and what they learned. How is it that we as followers of the Ahlul Bayt are doomed to repeat the same thing? So therefore, if there's a solution, I want to start a conversation around that solution, about what it is that we can actually serve in that regard. You see, I went to India last year, 2 years ago, 2020, and I saw something interesting there. I went to all these places. I went to Mumbai twice, Bhavnagar, Lucknow, you name it, Hyderabad, Bangalore. And what you noticed was there's this exceptional polarization there in India. You have this one group that is very adamant, and they say they are the stakeholders of Azadari, that we are the trustees of Azadari. And on the other side, they have these other guys who are saying that we want, they're saying that, this is what I was told, that they want this model of Wilayatul Faqih, that's what they want there, that's what they were telling me. And what I wanted us to really reflect on is, how are we helping to solve this problem? Allow me to explain. If you want to teach your children in one lesson, one thing you have to teach them is problem solving. You know, some of the biggest strategy firms in the world, the likes of McKinsey and Bain and Boston Consulting, many of the ones where your kids want to work at after they graduate, they teach you how to break down a problem. You have to first define the problem, number one. There's a book I recommend you read. It's called Bulletproof Problem Solving. It gives you 7 steps written by ex-McKinsey executives. And it says, look, this is how you break down a problem. Step 1, define the problem. Step 2, make sure that you disaggregate the problem. Break the problem down into its component parts. Now what you realize is, the people who are hardcore on both sides, they actually wanted something else, but they were not able to express it and understand it, so they were taking all of it in one go. What do I mean? The people who are adamant about the Wilayatul Faqih narrative, which was the Iranian model of running a society, they were saying that we want this, but when you ask them questions, you realize they actually wanted a progressive form of Shiaism that was developing society. But they thought the only way to get that is to go through that model. That model doesn't work everywhere. That model works in a particular country that is 95-96% monolithic Shia. That model doesn't work in Iraq. That model doesn't work in Pakistan. That model doesn't work in other countries. So in order to try to get some progress, they were saying, let's build that full-heartedly and wholeheartedly. The other side was, no, this is Azah, and we are entrusted, and we should make sure we get this to the next generation the way that we got it. And that's true. But at the same time, there may be, believe me, I hate to break it to you, when our ancestors, for those who are Sadat, they were first in Arabia, then they moved to Iran, then they moved to the subcontinent. Believe me, our ancestors were not speaking Urdu at home. They were speaking Arabic first, and then eventually they were speaking Farsi, and then eventually they were speaking Urdu. Your children or your grandchildren will not be speaking Urdu at home. I hate to break it to you. So what I'm trying to help you understand is, what is primary? Is Islam primary in my life, or is something else primary in my life? And until and unless we have these honest conversations, we're not going to be able to move forward. I'm not saying to stop what's already happening. But what I am saying is, there is a contingency and a demographic within our communities whose spiritual needs are not being served. How can you serve their needs also? How can you make both parties and several parties move together in one unison? And this is where this conversation is leading. So what did I say about the cross-pollination of ideas? Now I'm coming back to it. The cross-pollination of ideas leads to new understandings. You may say this is just a European example, but allow me to explain. We are followers of Bab-e Madinatul Ilm. And if we do not come to these conclusions of bridging the gap between East and West, then who will? That is, if we truly believe, and we have narrations that say ilm is the lost property of a believer, do we truly take that on board? You should get it from wherever you can. How many narrations we say about this, about knowledge, about ilm? Have we ever looked at the Ahlul Bayt from this dimension? Allow me to explain. When it comes to this diversity, there's a verse, one chapter which I highly recommend you read, not me, Allama Tabatabai recommends this. It's Surah Hashar of the Quran. Surah Hashar, if you can read the whole thing every night, maybe take it 3-4 minutes. If you can't, just the last verse 16 onwards, that should be enough. These are some of the most powerful verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, one verse says, Hu Allah. Who is Allah? Hu Allah. He is Allah. Who is Allah? Hu al-khaliqul bari'ul musawwir. Allah says. He is the one who is the maker, the creator, the fashioner, musawwir. Now this idea, how would we understand this? You know, sometimes we look at the Ahlul Bayt from one dimension, but do you know that Imam Amir al-Mu'minin is mazhar al-ajaib? That the French writer says that I am baffled by this individual, Ali, because he is the one individual who brings antithetical qualities into one human being. That at the same time he is the greatest warrior of his time and he is the greatest scholar of his time. I've never seen this. I've never understood this. Why? Cross-pollination of ideas. Do you know that we often don't talk about Amir al-Mu'minin's art? You may say, Amir al-Mu'minin, Imam Ali in art? Do you know that the Kufic script of calligraphy was created by Imam Ali alayhi salam? We don't talk about that dimension of him. So if Allah is saying, I am Musawwir, I am the fashioner, there must be someone on earth who reflects that attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is Amir al-Mu'minin, that dimensions of totality. We would not understand had it not been for Ahlul Bayt. We follow these individuals because we don't have better role models than them. We don't have better examples on this planet. Show me better examples, show me better role models, I'm willing to follow. We follow them, but there's so many dimensions of the Ahlul Bayt. Do you know, we talk about his courage in Badr, Uhud, Khandaq, Khaybar, no doubt. We talk about Amir al-Mu'mineen's knowledge in some dimensions, which is very good. But do we ever talk about Imam Ali as an entrepreneur? You know, we say that he was working for a Jewish person in the fields. Do you know, it was actually a joint venture, it was a JV, what we call a JV. It was not Imam Ali, the guy didn't employ Imam Ali. Imam Ali had a contract with them. I'm going to do this part, you're going to do this part, this is your profit sharing, this is my profit sharing. And then eventually this Imam Ali became very affluent. Do we ever talk about that dimension of his? Do we talk about his adherence as a political leader, as a leader of society, as a leader of the world? Do we talk about that or not? I'm trying to get us to have an environment where we don't have this polarization, where everywhere we go, I'm finding there's one Imam Barga, another Imam Barga, and there's more and more Imam Bargas moving. Why? People don't see eye to eye, they can't get together. And this is the challenge that we're facing. Now, the question comes, is there a possibility of cross-pollination of ideas? This country, building a Shia American identity, is something that's important. Why? And this is the line that it will take you some time, and it will take me some time to digest this. Remember, I'm not saying I'm right here. I'm just giving some points to think about that I'm reflecting from what I've heard in 13 years lecturing. And my hope is that we come together and we come to truth together. Not that I know, and I cannot know everything. We all have blind spots. We all have things that we're missing. But if we have a conversation together, how do we all work hand in hand for Shiaism? To make sure that it thrives, to make sure that it goes forward. We need to be honest in those regards. So what are some examples of going out of the cave and then coming back? Is that possible? Before we get to this, what's the history of America? If you don't know, you may start thinking this country is anti-America. I'll give you an example. In 2007, January, Keith Ellison swore in as the first Muslim congressman in American history. And he said, I'm going to swear in, not on the Bible, but I'm going to swear in on the Quran. And what's beautiful about this country is they accommodated him. When they accommodated him, they went to the Library of Congress, the largest library in the world, and they said, we will bring you a copy of the Quran. They brought a copy of the Quran, but it was a very special copy of the Quran. It was over 200 years old and it had inscribed on it the letters TJ. TJ standing for Thomas Jefferson. It was Thomas Jefferson's personal copy of the Quran, the person who was the main writer of the Declaration of Independence. He had two copies of the Quran, one as a young law student and another one after his library burnt, he bought it. It was George Sale's translation of the Quran. There's a beautiful book I recommend you read. It's called Thomas Jefferson's Quran, the history of Islam and the founding fathers. It's all details, all of these things. So this was one element of the equation. But I want you to remember, there's some names that you should not forget. One of those names is Dr. Henry Stubb. Dr. Henry Stubb is the first person in the Western Hemisphere who is documented on the record to say something in honor of Rasulullah that's positive, in honor of Islam that's positive. He said this 400 years ago. But he said it in a time where if it was public, they would take his head. That's how much animosity people may have had. So there's a lot of rift that was going on. So the book was underground. And he said the book was underground for many years, for hundreds of years, that it couldn't be public, but people were circulating it underground. And Dr. Henry Stubb said, look, we say Muhammad, for example, was marrying young girls, but hold on a second, in Rome at the same time, people were marrying girls of that same age, and the same thing was going on, but we don't say anything about that. It's a double standard, number one. He said, number two, we call Muhammad a polygamist, that he married more than one wife. What about Dawood or David in the Bible? He has at least 8 wives. Why the double standard? And he cited all of these things and he said, if you understand the essence of Muhammad, he was trying to do betterment for society. That book was underground. It wasn't published publicly until 1911 when some Muslims found it underground and they made it public. But underground, it was read by John Locke. John Locke also was someone who was the ideological father of Thomas Jefferson. He read it and he said that this seems to make sense. Further than this, the name that you need to know is George Sales. George Sales is one of the first translations in English of the Holy Quran. And this is the one that Jefferson had. Why? Because there were people in the history of America who were fighting for you and I, even though we may not have been there. By the way, historically, there were Muslims on this. Many of the slaves that were brought, who were not slaves in Africa, when they were brought here, they're actually Muslims. Example, Thomas Jefferson, not himself, but many people hypothesize it's possible that Jefferson did not know there were already Muslims in America. Proof and dalil, they say, is at that time, a slave was part of your tax return. So when they look at George Washington, the first president of the United States, his tax returns, he had 2 entries on the tax returns as property of his, and the names on the tax return were of 2 slaves, one named Fatima and the other one named Little Fatima. which refers to the daughter of the Holy Prophet. These were the property of George Washington. And they say it's very possible that Jefferson also had slaves who were Muslim. He didn't realize it. But what I'm saying to you is this. There were people who were fighting and said, look, we may disagree with what Muslims say, but they have a right to say it. Similarly, do we have that level of tolerance in our communities? I may disagree with someone, but they still have the right to say it. I need to have the hustler to listen to them, to hear them out, to say what is that view. So they may be reflecting what their children need. They may be reflecting what their family needs. They may be reflecting what the community needs to think about, so that we all move together. First principle. Second principle when it comes to this cross-pollination of ideas, now coming to Islam. Are there examples of scholars who went out of the cave and came back and they learned new things? And there are a plethora of them. Allow me to explain. Before we get to this, you have to understand something. For 300 years in the history of the world, from 800 to 1100 AD, Islam or Muslim civilizations were the head of scientific and Islamic knowledge. As you know by now, this is not a right differentiation, Islamic and non-Islamic. We made this, and this may be one of the declines of Islam, this separation. Nonetheless, the center of secular knowledge and religious knowledge was Baghdad. In that era, in that time came what? The likes of mathematics and things of that nature. Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabil was written in that time by Muhammad al-Khawarizmi. That's the first known book on algebra. That's where algebra comes from, Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabil. It was an applied business book, and Muhammad al-Khawarizmi wrote it. Now at that time, where does x come from? You know, 2x equals 6, divide both sides by 2, x equals 3. Many of us solve for x, we don't know where the x comes from. And the history of where the x comes from is, the reality of the matter is, when that book Kitab al-Jabr al-Muqabil was written, it had paragraphs in it. It did not have equations as we do today. So when it was translated from Arabic to Greek, they said, how do we go from this to that? The words there, the equations were in sentence forms. And so they said 2 times a thing equals 6. So 2 times a thing equals 6. What's the Arabic word for thing? Shay. 2 times a shay equals 6. So then when they came to Greek, they said, how do you translate this? They said, we don't have shay. So they said, we're going to use the Greek letter chi. You know, chi squared, which is 6, something like that. Chi. So shay became chi. When they translated the Greek books to Latin, they said, we don't have chi in Latin. What do we use? They said, we're going to use x. That's the heritage of it. Now the idea was, this is where you had discomfort. In fact, our world doesn't run without Khawarizmi. What do you mean? What does Google run on? What does Amazon run on? What does Meta run on? What does Microsoft run on? They run on something called an algorithm, right? Algorithm is a direct Latinization of Khawarizmi. Now, why am I telling you this? Why am I saying this? Because there was an era where all of this proliferation of knowledge and wisdom is coming out of that era and that time. But at the same time, in that same environment, what happened? And they say 2 things happened. One argument that they make is the fatwa of Ghazali. Now, did Ghazali really give it, or did somebody else give it, or it was pressure of Nizam al-Mulk, the original Nizam al-Mulk, or something else? But someone gave the fatwa. Same line I said a couple nights ago. Jisko bhi Sheikh o Shah ne hukm khuda diya qarar, humne nahi kiya wo kaam, haan ba khuda nahi kiya, aur nisbat-e ilm hai bahut hakim-e waqt ko aziz, usne to kar-e jahl bhi be ulama nahi kiya. And that's the history of all rulership. That's the history of every time and space. The Shah has always used the ulama at every moment in time. By the way, this is happening in our communities till this day. You may not realize it, you may not recognize it, but there's Shah, Sheikh and Shah till this day. At the same point in time, when this emerged, when this happened at that point in time, when you look at the history and the dynamics of what's going on here, you learn some valuable lessons, which oftentimes we are not willing to cover. Why was there, that was the first graph falling. Mathematics is the work of the devil. They said it on the name of Ghazali. Now, the other argument they say it is on the basis of the banning of the printing press. That is, Gutenberg invents a printing press in Europe, and it was the internet of its time. And the Ottomans came, and they rejected and they accepted. By the way, this is a little bit of a westernization and a whitewashing of history. By the way, I mean, they don't talk about how Ibn Sina or Avicenna, who was an Ismaili Shia, and then eventually they say he became a Ithna Ashari Shia. His book, the Al-Qanun fi Tib, the Canon of Medicine, was the main book in medical schools up until 400 years ago. And so that legacy is also there. People forget about that dimension of the equation. But what am I really trying to draw at? What am I really trying to say here? That was an era and that was a time where the scientific technological hub and the hub of knowledge in Islam was the same. Now the hubs have differed. The hub of Islamic knowledge today is in Najaf and Qom. But that is not the hub of science and technology today. The hub of science and technology today is America, in particular the west coast of America and the east coast of America and Chicago, the big cities of America. And from there the knowledge proliferates, and from there it goes to the rest of the world. So how do we bridge this gap? Was it possible that there were scholars in the history of Islam who, from our school of thought, who actually tried to bridge this gap? I'll give you some examples. Khwaja Nasiruddin al-Tusi, Shia alim mujtahid of the highest caliber, number one. His student or his teacher, Allama Hilli, who I mentioned the other night. Allama Hilli and Khwaja Nasiruddin al-Tusi, they had a catch and pitch relationship. You know, Copernicus's model of the universe is not complete without something called the Tusi couple in mathematics. In fact, the graph is exactly the same. The only difference is Tusi came years before Copernicus. Anyways, Tusi was an alim, Islamic scholar, as well as a mathematician and an intellectual and things of that nature. Anyways, Allama Hilli used to teach his student Khwaja Nasiruddin al-Tusi Islamic studies, Quran, Hadith and these things. But Allama Hilli, look at the intellectual human. Allama Hilli used to learn from his student Nasiruddin al-Tusi in the areas of math and physics and chemistry and astronomy. This is the scholarship that was there in the history of Shia Islam. First example. Second example, you may say this is an old example. Let me give you a contemporary example. Allama Tabatabai Sahib Tafsir al-Mizan. Allama Tabatabai, his teacher Allama Qadi Tabatabai, now Allama Tabatabai, as you know, he passed away in the 80s. He was not hundreds of years ago, 1980s. He came forward and said, look, his teacher said, I want you to study the Islamic curriculum, Quran, Hadith, all this, but I also want you to study mathematics, riyaziyat, and geometry and these things. Now, somebody at that time, why are you telling him to study that? You'll understand later. So Allama Tabatabai said, I got the top scholar in mathematics to give me 1 hour of the day. He said, I have 1 hour, it's right after Salatul Zuhr. After that, I don't have any time, that's the only time I have. So he said, look, I'll take it. So Allama Tabatabai used to walk in the middle of the difficult summer in the heat of the day. You know, the Arba'in walk, many people have not been able to do it because the heat is so blistering right now in the day. They have to do it in the night. This is what he was doing. And he said, I used to wash myself off before I met my teacher so I did not smell in front of him. This is why mujtahid comes from the root word juhad, or to struggle. It's not an easy path. It's very difficult. By the way, do we teach people about these things? Side note, do you know that many people are gravitating towards Buddhism and, for example, yoga? And I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying, they're saying they get practical benefits from it. Some of the biggest thinkers of our world are saying this. And many times, father and mother and children are saying, better read namaz, read namaz, read namaz. Maulana Sayyid, get my kids to read namaz. It's very important, no doubt. But believe me, if we went back to the root of what namaz was supposed to provide and used to provide, and that was transformation, you would not have to ask your children to read namaz. They would be reading namaz themselves. In fact, you would find that the same way that people are going to Buddhism and yoga for practical benefits, non-Muslims would be reading namaz. Because they would say that there are practical benefits of this that are solving my problems. That's what the essence of it was. You still have to read namaz. But I'm giving you an example. The Dalai Lama, the head of Tibetan Buddhism, was on an interfaith panel with Dr. Sayyid Hussain Nasr and others at Emory University. And they're sitting there, and the Dalai Lama says, I've heard that jihad that we hear on the media is not what it means. You know, sometimes people in the media, I met the president of one of the biggest universities in America, UCF, and he didn't know this either. You know the word fatwa, we know what fatwa means. It means a religious ruling. Most Americans think fatwa means death sentence because of the Rushdie ruling. They don't know that because we haven't explained to them. They think it means, so he says, the president of UCF says, I didn't know that. I thought it meant death sentence. Similarly, people think jihad means holy war. That's not what it means, obviously. Jihad means struggle. So he says that my friends tell me, the head of Tibetan Buddhism says, that my friends tell me that jihad does not mean this, jihad means struggle or internal struggle. And Sayyid Hussain Nasr says, look, yes. He says this is based on a hadith where Rasulullah saw people coming back from the war and everyone was saying, congratulations to those who are coming back from the struggle or the jihad. And Rasulullah said, say this, congratulations to those who are coming back from the minor struggle towards the major struggle. So what do you mean minor to major? They said, what do you mean, Ya Rasulullah? He said, that's the minor struggle of the battlefield. The big major struggle is this struggle right here. The heart, the mind. And then the head of the Dalai Lama says, if that's the case, then all of Buddhism can be encapsulated in the Islamic concept of jihad. Did we ever explain it to people that way? Did we ever tell people what is spirituality in the Islamic sense? What is it? We have much things to offer people outside these walls, believe me. There are people who are Hindu or Christian or Jewish, they are starving and craving for the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. If we get it to them, if we show it to them, the benefits that, but first we need to benefit from it as well. So the concept that comes here and that emerges here, when you learn this, you understand something. So Allama Tabatabai said that he understood it. When did it pay dividends? It paid dividends later on, when they were expanding the Hujjatiyya seminary in Qom. When they were expanding the Hujjatiyya seminary in Qom, what happened? One after the other, Allama Hujjatiyya is looking at these blueprints. This is no good, no good, no good. Best civil engineers, best architects from Tehran and all over the world are sending their blueprints. He's saying none of these take the Islamic philosophy into consideration. None of these consider what it's like to be a student from the Islamic dimensions. Until he looked at one blueprint, he said, this is the one. All the students said, whose blueprint was accepted? They thought maybe this engineer or that architect. He said, no. They said, there's a Sayyid who's moved here from Tabriz. He lives on this address. They went to the address, opened the doors, Allama Tabatabai. The idea being that he had more comprehensive, he had ventured out of the cave and he came back. In fact, because he was a philosopher, to understand Tafsir al-Mizan, you have to have some prerequisites in philosophy. In philosophy, one of the branches of philosophy is tolerance and toleration. So you notice that in the afkar, in the thinking of Allama Tabatabai, he is much more tolerant of others than other people are. Because he went out of the cave, he studied philosophy and he understood the dynamics to the extent that Allama Tabatabai had a correspondence with Henri Corbin, the French writer, and they had a correspondence, and he says, Allama Tabatabai says, in theory, Hinduism, in theory, is monotheistic. But at the level of practice, it has gone to polytheism. After reading it in depth, don't become Hindu, I'm not telling you to do that. I know your parents are having a heart attack. But I'm saying this to those people who say, why has Islam become so intolerant today? These views don't trickle down to you. These are the things that I'm trying to share with you. Next level of the equation. Allama Tabatabai, studying philosophy and studying mathematics and all of these things, may have expanded his mind. He went out of the cave and came back and expanded his knowledge. First example. Second example. Shahid al-Sadr. I'm giving you those scholars that nobody can say these are not mainstream. These are these Asal and Asas. These are some of the biggest scholars who are the mainstream scholars. Shahid al-Sadr. Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr is that scholar who many Maraja today said if he was alive, we would not declare our Marja'iyah. This individual had studied economics. First of all, he has a book I recommend you read called Falsafatuna, or Philosophy, and second book, Iqtisaduna. They're dense works. Iqtisaduna meaning our economics. In fact, if you remove Baqir al-Sadr from Islamic economics, all of Islamic economics, it falls, it collapses. He's holding up Shia and Sunni economics by himself. So what happened? He came forward and said, look, he had studied capitalism, communism, Marxism, and he had studied Islamic economics. And he said that we've got it wrong. His view. I'm giving this as a minority view, and every scholar disagreed with him. But I'm sharing this with you to try to explain that the Hawza is an intellectual university. It's a seminary. So we need to understand that. So he said, what is haram in the Bible and the Quran is the same. It is yusri. Riba is the Arabic word. Riba is the Arabic word. And he says that is translated into English as usury. He said not interest, because he understood something that everyone understands when they take their first business class or their first MBA class, which is there's a notion called time value of money. That is, or this idea of inflation or opportunity cost or the basket of goods. So if you give me $100 today and I give you $100 in a year, it's not the same $100. There's opportunity cost. With inflation right now, maybe I give you $90 back. So he says what was haram was this notion of riba. As the Bible also says, the one time where Jesus gets upset in the Bible is where there is righteous indignation when they turn the temple into a money exchange. Jesus gets very upset. Same principle. Loan sharking is what was prohibited, to put people into economic slavery. That is what Islam was not looking for. That's what Christianity was not looking for. So he said, Shaykh Sadr, that a flat rate of interest that makes the person whole again is acceptable. Because the idea was that you should not have economic slavery, but to get you back to your $100, I should give you something that gets you back to your $100. All the other scholars disagreed with him. But I'm sharing this with you because he ventured out of the cave and he came back to the cave. And he said that within the mainstream of Islam, this is something that is applicable. Further than this, come to our members. There was a time where we had great scholars. I'm not for this English-Urdu divide. I think it's a poor divide. I think we should focus on content. We used to have great scholars in the Urdu language, the likes of Turabi, Rashid Turabi. We had great scholars, the likes of Ali Naqi Naqavi, Naqan Sahab. These were great scholars whose intellectual caliber was one of the highest. Turabi's own son, who we commemorated his 50th Barsi, I still listen to Turabi's lectures although he died many years ago. And I'm like, this guy was ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve. He was talking about Islam and psychology in the 60s. He was talking about Islam and human rights well before in the 60s. He was talking about these subjects that you still don't hear. What happened? His own son says that my dad used to study Islamic sciences and Islamic knowledge 11 months out of the year. By the way, if many of you knew what I'm about to say, maybe people would put kufr fatwas on him. This is the lack of tolerance. I was told by one of his close companions or friends, he used to get select special books sent by the Shah of Iran as a gift. And he used to read these books, and he used to benefit from these books. Now people would say, oh, this person's a kafir because he's getting books from the Shah of Iran. But he's reading ilm, and he's transferring it to you. We don't have this tolerance to understand the dynamics of the equation. But anyways, he said, my dad used to, 11 months out of the year, he would study only Islamic sciences, and he's reading the Quran, the Hadith, and all this. But 1 month before Ayyam Azah, he would close his books. And when he would close his books, he would read about the world. He would read about Reader's Digest. He would read about what's happening in the world. Today, there's a disconnect. That is, people are spending their lives in ivory towers. There is no communication between the mimbar and the ground. How do we bridge that gap? Ali Naqvi, the world did not do justice with him. He was not only an alim, a mujtahid. They say he's the last mujtahid from the subcontinent who was lecturing. And he was at Aligarh Muslim University, and people did not have the tolerance in our communities to be able to understand. My goal here is we revive that. Now the Center of Science and Technology is here and the Islamic Markaz is there. How do we have a conversation to bridge this gap so that people understand, so they understand and we understand their perspective? We may be saying this is what science and technology is going, and they may say, hold on, you're looking at everything from a materialistic lens. Look at it from another lens also. Maybe we can learn something from them as well, and maybe they can learn something. I tell you this because some of them, we are victims to what we hear and what we learn and the media we get. We may have presumptions about their world and they may have presumptions about our world. I'll give you an example. 2015, I went to Najaf to meet some of the scholars with some young speakers. We went to an orphanage. When we went to an orphanage, this one young boy there, we wanted to spend time. Amir al-Mu'mineen, one of his last statements on his deathbed, he says, Allah Allah fil Quran, Allah Allah fil Aitam, Allah Allah fil Masakin. By Allah the Quran, by Allah the orphans, by Allah the Masakin. He's telling you what you need to look after in society. So we went to meet some of the orphans, and one of the orphans asked, where are you guys from? We said, some are from UK, some are from Canada, some are from America. As soon as he heard America, he changed, his face changed. His demeanor changed, and became very angry. And we're seeing him turn angry in front of our eyes. And we're wondering what's going on here? And eventually that anger shifts into tears. They said, so what happened here? And he's getting upset. He said, go, leave, I don't want you here. And we asked, what happened? They said this young man, his father was killed by American soldiers. And so that's all he knows about America. And we all melted. And we said, wow. First example. Second example. We met one of the top scholars, one of the Maraja. I won't take the name. My goal is not to say something negative. I have the utmost respect for our ulama. What I'm saying is, are we doing our job? So he was one of the scholars who had just declared his marja'iyah, and he spoke English a little bit. And he was talking to us, and he said, I was just given a book by someone, and I read the whole book, and the book was saying, by the way, he's a tremendous scholar. Please don't take this the wrong way. Please try to listen to what I'm about to say with an open heart. But after he spent a whole half an hour explaining to us that this book that was given to him, that was in English, that he was reading, he said it explained that Einstein at the end of his life became a Shia Muslim. And we all sat there and said, that the probability of that is very low. But none of us would have the guts to say that to him. And my question is, why didn't someone from our community filter that out before giving him that book to say that you should not be reading this book, you need to be reading something credible. Similarly, scholars are human beings. As you know, the Nobel Prize was won by Dr. Daniel Kahneman in behavioral economics. When he won the Nobel Prize, he said economics has a fundamental assumption. The fundamental assumption is that human beings are rational. He overturned this and he said psychology. He was a psychologist and he won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he said the reason is we are not rational. We make many mistakes in our thinking. So our scholars, maybe if people constantly tell them Americans are like this, Americans are like that, British are like this, British are like that, maybe they start believing sincerely. Not because they're naive or not because of anything. That's the information that we're given. If I am told something about someone else, and I don't filter and check the other side of the story, these problems and these dynamics will happen. So what do you do today? And what is the solution? What's the end game? Today, from coast to coast, everywhere I'm going, people are telling me, Sayyid, how do we keep our people around? How do we stop people from leaving? What do we do? The first principle is you have to understand the challenge. Right now we have a check the box culture. The check the box culture is start on time, end on time, ziyarat, dua, this, check. And you realize the check the box culture, although it may have been helpful up to some point, it's not enough to get us to the next phase. What are people looking for? Our KPIs, our OKRs, the way that we measure, the metrics that we look at in order to measure the success need to shift and change. What are people looking for? They're looking for transformation. Is the Imam Barga, is the Husainiyah, is the mosque causing me a transformation in life? Because right now it's seen as zero-sum game. Zero-sum game meaning that if I come to the Imam Barga, if I come to the Husainiyah, if I come there, I'm losing out on work, I'm losing out on school, I'm losing out on social life. But what if we created the Imam Barga in such a way that people say, I cannot miss Imam Barga, I cannot miss Husaini, I cannot miss it, because without it, my work life suffers, without it, my school life suffers, without it, my whole life suffers. And you can do that, believe me, by using the model, by using the learning in this community. There's tremendous talent in our community, believe me. We just have to leverage it. We are one of the most accomplished communities in America, one of the most educated, one of the best communities in so many regards. The only challenge is we don't have glue connecting everything. We need some structure and infrastructure to get the thought leaders. Believe me, I tell you this with my hand on my heart. I met one of my mentors. You always need mentors in life and guides in life who can give you things at different angles. He's a unique person because he's been very successful in this world. He's academically and economically and otherwise. He's had several startups that have gone public and that have done very well. He's one of the most affluent members of our community. He's also very religious and Maulai and all of these things. And he said, we were having a conversation. We're very close and we talk pretty regularly. And he's somebody who is a genius by every measure. But he also has a tremendous amount of love of the Ahlul Bayt and Islam. And anyways, he said, Shabbir bhai, I need to tell you something. I went on this journey of community development. He says, my first startup was very successful. I made a lot of money and I wanted to help the community and I wanted to fund some projects and do things. And when I was embarking on this journey, there was a Maulana there who was in town and he said, Jafri Sahab, you are embarking on a journey to serve the community, but I'm going to say it in Urdu and I'll translate. He said, Magar aap is raah mein aap zakhmi ho jayenge. He said, you will get injured, you will get hurt. He said, I met him 20 years later and I met the Maulana and said, Maulana Sahab, you told me this, do you remember that? I said, yes. He said that you said that I'm going in this path and I will be zakhmi. I said, yes. He said, I want to tell you that main zakhmi nahi hua, main shaheed ho gaya. And that was the reality of the matter. You see, the reason we're not getting many of our youth here, the reason we're not getting people here, he says that I didn't get injured, I got martyred. That's what he said, for those who may not have caught that. And the reason is because we are saying these are institutions of the Ahlul Bayt, but people are coming here and they are not finding the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. And that's the challenge we're facing. These institutions need to be run with the akhlaq of the Ahlul Bayt. I went to London and I saw an amazing Imam Barga that was from the Iraqi community. We should learn from other communities. Maybe they can learn from us, maybe we can learn from them in other communities. Everyone was suited up in pishpat. When you walked in, the Majlis Imam said, you smell oud. It was the most amazing scent, the most amazing atmosphere. They said, I asked them, what's different about here? They said, the methodology of management here is that we are not management. We are Khuddam al-Husayn. We are the servants of Imam Hussain. That every person who walks in this door is a guest of Imam Hussain. And we treat them the way that Imam Hussain alayhi salam would want their guests to be treated. It was a different paradigm. I saw another Imam Barga that I went on my travels. They said, our methodology is that we want this Imam Barga to be a markaz for the Imam of our time. As soon as he comes, we hand off the keys to him. So every decision is based on that methodology. Would the Imam want this or not? It's a different paradigm, it's a different dynamic. To think about that, to understand that. I say that many times, and I'm drawing to a conclusion here. Many people say that, Sayyid, you need to tell our children, tell them to come, tell them to come. And I say to them, should I really tell them to come or not? I'll give you an example. The same mentor of mine, he told me, he said, Shabbir, I need to tell you something because one thing you need to learn in life, I'm still thinking, I've just had a son, and I'm thinking what lessons I want to teach my son. That you should be good and kind and compassionate, but you should also not be naive. I told you the story, the line of Montesquieu, 3 teachers. The world being the most primary one, but your parents, the schoolmaster, and the world. There's a reason I mentioned that. He said, Shabbir, you need to work on one thing. I said, what do I need to work on? Because one of the things, even in Islamic spirituality, is understand your blind spots. What am I missing? What am I weak in? What do I need to develop? He said, Shabbir, he told me this some time ago. He said, Shabbir, you're naive. You need to work on that. I said, I know it's tough to swallow when someone gives you that, but you have to reflect on it, and he was right. I said, what do you mean? He said, you came to recite in our community, and I know you, and you're always looking for the best interest of the community, and you're always trying to do what's good for the community. And he says, I know your methodology, and I know your philosophy. When I first started lecturing, I didn't take any hadiyah, but then someone took me in the corner and said, look, you don't need it, but other people need it. You're undercutting them. And the other thing was my schedule was getting too full. So I said, whatever the standard rate is, whatever the flat rate is. So he said, you need to know what's happening behind the scenes. I said, what's happening behind the scenes? He says, you are not asking for any hadiyah, and the people are saying this, that you are not, you're saying whatever the rate is because you don't want to burden the community. Do you know what's happening behind the scenes? I said, no. He said, people are saying, the people who are organizing are saying that Sayyid Shabbir wants thousands of dollars for each majlis. And everyone's opened up their wallets because they're saying you're transforming, our kids are coming back. So everyone's putting out the money. But the reality is, I know and you know, none of that money is going to you. All that money is going to the speaker who's coming after you, who has demanded $1,000 per lecture, and nobody wants to pay up. So when this happens, I say, Alhamdulillah, they are not coming. And that's the harsh reality. The reality of the matter is the way that are there, by the way, every community has their problem. Jewish community, Christian community, all communities have their problems. I'm talking to you about this community because this is our community. Have there not been gunshots in our communities? In Imam Bargas? Have there not been, ask some of your parents about the history, they'll tell you, have there not been lawsuits in our community? Have there not been fights, physical fights in our communities? Have there not been X, Y, and Z in our communities? How do we resolve issues in our communities and follow the Ahlul Bayt? Meet me outside. That's Ahlul Bayt? So I say, Alhamdulillah, they're not coming. It's a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you want Islam, remember one thing, and I'm concluding here, and you will not like to digest this. And that is the reality, because nobody will tell you this, because it takes courage and it's difficult. The reality is you cannot get true Islam from the mimbar. You will get one slice of Islam from the mimbar. You will not get it in totality. The incentive structure that we have made is completely upside down, number one. Number two, how do you get true Islam? You start discussion circles with your families, with your close ones, in people's houses, if you can do it in Imam Barga, wherever you do it, take Dua Arafah, read it and reflect on it. Recite the Quran, read it, reflect on it. That's how you will get true Islam. You may find that in this, the questions emerge, how far out of the cave do you want to go? Look, this same person who I told you, who said I became Shaheed, and by the way, you don't need to take his opinion, but I'm just telling you, by every metric that we study, he's made it. So he said, one, I became Shaheed. The other one, he says, you need to not be naive. The third thing he said, Shabbir, look, I was the Salare Dasta of the Matami Sangha when I came here. Salare Dasta. I was the head of the Matami circle. I was leading Matam. And I was the one responsible for the Matam. And he says, 25 years on, I have realized as hard it is for me to be a Matami, an Azadar of Imam Hussain, I realized that Matam alone will not save my children. And that was the very difficult, bitter pill, he said, that no Maulana has the guts to say, because ulama are afraid. They're afraid of you. They're afraid of me. And it has been throughout times. And that's the challenge, that if you want Islam, I believe in my heart of hearts, we have the most perfect religion. But you have to go to the books to learn that religion. You have to go to the Ahlul Bayt directly to get that information and that knowledge. And it requires effort. And that's what nobody has the courage to tell you and I. I hope you can take what I've said with an open heart, and I hope that it leads to us coming to an understanding where we're not fighting, where we know how to resolve issues amicably with the akhlaq of the Ahlul Bayt, and not labeling people and saying this person's wilayatul faqih, this person's azadari, this person's anti-azadari, this person's anti-marja'iyya, this person anti. Just have some akhlaq of the Ahlul Bayt and some sabr and tahammul, and inshallah we can go together. We turn our hearts to Karbala and Kufa and Sham. The narrations say that there was a moment in time where Yazid called on Imam Sajjad. You've given too much time to me. May Allah bless you and your families. Give the next few moments to Ali Muhammad. Give the next few moments to Ahlul Bayt. They say they called on Imam Sajjad, and Imam Sajjad, he left from the zindan, he left from the prison, he left, and they called on Imam Sajjad and they said, O Zain al-Abidin, or they said, O Ali ibn al-Husayn, you have been given the permission to leave. You can now leave. You can now go back to your homes. At that point in time, Imam Sajjad, he goes back, and when he goes back to the zindan, when he goes back to the dungeon, he goes to his Aunt Zainab. He says, my Aunt Zainab, we have been given the permission to leave. We are allowed to leave. At that point in time, what would you like to do? Now he's the Imam, but he's showing the principle and the maqam of Zainab. That is, Zainab was the one who was there with Imam Hussein at every moment in time. That when Rasulullah was there and left this world, Zainab was with Imam Hussein. At every moment in time, when Amir al-Mu'mineen left, Zainab was there. When Fatima al-Zahra left, Zainab was there. When Imam Hassan left, Zainab was there. Now Hussein has left. Imam is showing the respect to Bibi Zainab, that my Aunt Zainab, that he would say, Anti alima ghayr muallima, you are a teacher, you are above any teacher, you are the one who is a scholar above any teacher. She says, my son Sajjad, I will not go anywhere until I do the majlis of my brother Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. It's been a long time. I have not been able to cry for my brother. I have not been able to mourn for my brother. I have not been able to remember him. Ajrukum ala Allah. She said, I want to make sure that we have a majlis for my brother Aba Abdullah and for the shuhada. Tell Yazid to give us a room. Tell Yazid to make sure he gives us back those things that were looted from us. We will have a majlis, and until then we will not go back. Ajrukum ala Allah, ajrukum ala Allah. They made the arrangements. A room was given. The women and the children, they sat down in the room. One by one, the tabarrukat began to come. One by one, the things began to come. They say that slowly but surely the different things that belong to the Ahlul Bayt began to come. They say then the heads of the Shuhada began to come. They said the head of Qasim came. Farwa took the head. They say the head of Ali al-Akbar came. Layla took the head. They say that the heads came one by one, and one by one the Ahlul Bayt began to take them up until the point in time. They said the head of Abu al-Fadl Abbas came, and the head of Imam al-Husayn came. When the head of Imam Hussein came, all of the bibia, all the ladies had taken the heads and they would hug the head. There were two heads that were in the corner. There was no one to cry for them. A lady called out, these two moons, it seems that their mother is not alive. Zainab turned. She said, don't say that. Those are my sons. But who is there to cry for the son of Fatima al-Zahra? Who is there to cry for Aba Abdullah? Ajrukum ala Allah. Ajrukum ala Allah. You've had a long day. May Allah bless you. May Allah bless your families. May Allah bless you. You've been spending the whole day. But ask Ahlul Bayt, who had to travel in the heat of the desert, and they were not even allowed to mourn for their loved ones. Someone would strike them. Someone would hurt them. Ajrukum ala Allah. My dear young ones, I need to give you a message here. Remember, if you ever hear that someone says that these masayib we cannot accept, these masayib are exaggerated, these masayib are this, I need you to remember something. What you are really saying is that I would not do what those enemies did, but in reality I believe you would not do that, but they were the most zalim of people. I remember a few years ago, 10 years ago, there was a situation where one of the generals of these terrorist organizations, ISIS, he cut and ate the organs of one of our Shias, and you saw it. I didn't sleep it. I was thinking, this was 1,000 years on. What must they have done in Karbala? Do you know that Imam Sajjad says, just know one thing, O our Shias, you would not be able to bear if you truly knew what they did to us. Allahu Akbar. Number one and number two, if nothing else, for those who are against, the things that are most mustanad in all of the riwayat are the tears for Sayyid al-Shuhada and the poetry in honor of Sayyid al-Shuhada. There are so many narrations. But if none of that works for you, I'll tell you one thing. At least listen to what Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr said at GW. He said the Shia community should thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if nothing else, that how many hundreds of millions of dollars they save in therapy costs because of the Masa'ib of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Allahu Akbar. He says that mother who lost a son, she uses the Majlis of Abu Abdullah to remember her son in the remembrance of Ali Akbar. That mother, that widow who lost her husband, she remembers Imam al-Hussein and Rabab. It is the healing and the ointment of our wounds. It is the marham for our hearts. The zikr of Abu Abdullah. Ajrukum ala Allah. I won't take much of your time. This qafila got together, this caravan got together from Sham, and when they got there from Sham, they proceeded on their journey back to their home. But on this journey there came a moment in time where Bishr, who was the one leading this caravan, he comes to Imam Sajjad. He says, "Oh Sajjad, oh Zainul Abidin, there are two paths. One road leads to Medina, one road leads to Karbala. Where will you go?" Imam Sajjad, again he's the Imam, but he's teaching a principle. He says, "My aunt Zainab, one road to Medina, one road to Karbala. Where will you go? Where will we go?" Bibi Zainab says, "Take me to Karbala. I want to weep for my brother Abu Abdullah. I want to see my brother. I have not seen him." Ajrukum ala Allah, ajrukum ala Allah. This caravan proceeds. It proceeds towards Karbala. When it proceeds towards Karbala, they say from the other side, Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari is coming. He has lost his sight. He is coming in a state where he wants to do the ziyarah of Sayyid al-Shuhada. They say he has a companion with him to help him on his journey. He comes, and at that point in time, he says, "Take me towards the grave." He says, "I cannot see." He says, "Take me towards the grave of Hussein." When they take him towards the grave of Imam al-Hussein, he gets by the grave of Imam al-Hussein. He says, "Leave me here." He says, "Habibi Hussein, my beloved Hussein, answer me Hussein." 3 times he says it, and then he says that how would you answer me? I heard they severed your head. I heard they butchered you in the most brutal way. And Jabir is saying this marsiya on the grave of Abu Abdullah. Ajrukum ala Allah. From the other side, they say the family of Imam al-Hussein is coming. When from the other side the family is coming, at that point in time, Jabir says with his companion that let us go away. Let us see what is the matter. At that point in time, from the distance they see that this is Ali Muhammad. He tells Jabir, these are the family of the Ahlul Bayt. They come, and at that point in time, when they begin to land there and stay there at the Karbala, at the land that they were, it seems that the mothers, that the wives, the families, they go to those graves that they have been seeking. They say Farwa goes to the grave of Qasim, Layla goes to the grave of Ali ibn Akbar. They say that one after the other, Rabab is looking for the grave of Ali ibn Asghar. Allah knows. Where did Zainab go? Some say she went to Imam Hussein, and some say that she went to the Furat, to the Al-Qama, to say Abbas. Shall I tell you what happened in Sham? Shall I tell you what happened in Kufa? Shall I tell you? Ajrukum ala Allah. They say that Imam Sajjad had a meeting with Jabir. They met over the grave of Sayyid al-Shuhada. When they went over the grave of Sayyid al-Shuhada, Jabir and Imam Sajjad, they hugged one another. Imam Sajjad says, Jabir, be light on me, be careful on me. Why? Because from Karbala to Kufa to Sham, the shackles cut into my flesh, they cut into my bone. Ajrukum ala Allah. Imam, this was the first friend outside the family that he had seen. He said, oh, Jabir says to Imam Sajjad, Yabna Rasulullah, tell me what happened on Ashura. He says, oh, Jabir, where shall I begin? Where shall I end? Just know one thing, that on Shabbir Ghariban, they did the most difficult thing. Do you know what happened? You tell the person who is your Hamdard, the one who has love and affection for you, tell them the most difficult thing. He says, on Shabbir Ghariban after Ashura, they called out and they said that we will trample over the bodies with the horses. Jabir, there were people who said, we will not allow this. They said, take your loved ones, take them away. Jabir, do you know what happened? Left on the plains of Karbala was the son of Fatima az-Zahra. Jabir, my father, was on the plains of Karbala. Jabir, they drove horses over the body of my father. Jabir, I heard his bones breaking beneath the hooves of the horses. Jabir, I couldn't do anything to help. Jabir, do you know what it's like for a son to hear the bones of his father breaking and not be able to do anything to help him? Jabir, where do I begin? Where do I end? Ajrukum ala Allah. Ajrukum ala Allah. These are the masa'ib. But Allah knows these mothers of Karbala. How did they separate from their loved ones? How did they separate from the ones that they have loved so much? How did they leave Karbala? They got to Karbala, but how did they leave? I'll explain to you. There's a manzar, there's a moment in the bazaar of Sham. They say that there was a lady who was from there, and she was looking at the heads on the spears, and she was staring at the heads on the spears until she saw one head, and she was staring at this head and staring at this head. A person from Ahlul Bayt, she comes and she says to that lady, oh lady, what are you looking at? What are you staring at? She says, I'm looking at this face, and this is the most beautiful person I've ever seen in my life, and I am just wondering, and I'm thinking, and I'm saying one dua to myself, and that dua is this, that I pray to Allah that this youth's mother is not alive to see this moment and this day. Layla's heart broke. She said, don't say that. That is my son Ali Akbar. I've been watching him from Karbala to Kufa and Sham. Ask me what's going through my heart. Allah knows what was going through the hearts of the mothers of Karbala. How did they leave their loved ones? How did they leave the graves of Ali Akbar and Qasim and Owner Muhammad and the Ahlul Bayt? It is one of the most greatest tragedies, the departure from Karbala. Perhaps Rabab, she was having the most difficult time. The mother of Sakina, the mother of Aliun al-Asghar, when they wanted to leave, they say that Imam Sajjad was getting everyone together, and then there's a moment in time when Imam Sajjad is getting everyone together, he notices that someone is not there. The same way when they were departing from Sham, that all the women got together, and Bibi Zainab said, one person is missing. She said, who is missing? She says, I know who's missing and I know where she is. Bibi Zainab went back in the Zindan. She saw her mother onto the grave of her daughter. It was Rabab. She said, my daughter Sakina, you wanted to go home. We're going home. This same mother is in Karbala. She says, Sajjad, I'm not going back, Sajjad. My son, I cannot leave Karbala. He says, my mother, why? Why? He says that when I left Medina, I had my husband and I had my son and I had my daughter. But now my husband is here, my son is here, and my daughter is in Sham. I will remain here. Imam Sajjad said, my mother, what will you do staying here? She says that I will clean off these graves. I will tell people this is the grave of Hussein. This is the grave of Ali Asghar. This is the grave of Qasim. This is the grave of Abbas. I will tell them. Imam Sajjad, he said, insisted, and he said, Bibi Rabab, come with us. She went on the journey, but they say that she promised that she would never go in the shade ever while she was alive. Until her final moment, she kept this promise. The poet captures this moment, what does one say about the heart of Rabab? Karbala se jo kabhi hoke hawa aati hai, kisi masoom ki हिचकी की सदा आती है और हाथ अड़कता न हो मरकद में कहीं कल्ब रुबाब, अली असगर की सदा आती है. The poet says that this the cry of Ali al-Asghar is hitting my ear. I hope Rabab is not hearing this cry. Ajrukum ala Allah. They went back when they proceeded back towards Medina. When they got back towards Medina, the narrations say that Imam Sajjad, he said to Bishr or Bashir, both names have been given. He said that I have heard that your father was a poet. He said, yes, my father was a poet. And he says that, do you also recite some poetry? He said, yes, Yabna Rasulillah, I attempt to write some poetry. He says, then tell the people that we have returned in your poetic form. At that point in time, he goes and he comes in front of the people and he calls out to the people and he says to the people, Ya ahla Yathrib, la maqama lahum biha, qad qutila al-Husayn بكربلاء. Oh people of Yathrib, oh people of Medina, this is not a place to live anymore. This is not a place to stay anymore. Why? قتل الحسين بكربلاء. They have butchered Hussein in Karbala. They have beheaded Hussein in Karbala. The same time narrations say that Bibi Zainab said some poetry. When people ask where do the Marsiyas begin, they begin from the Ahlul Bayt. They begin from Bibi Zainab. The Marasi began there. Bibi Zainab stood at the foot of Medina and she said, Medina tu jattina la taqbalina. Oh Medina of our grandfather, don't accept us. Don't accept us. Why? Because when we left, we had Qasim, we had Ali Akbar, we had Abbas, we had Hussein. Now we are returning to you. There is no one with us. We are coming empty-handed. Ajrukum ala Allah. Ajrukum ala Allah. I'm concluding here. They say when they finally got back, Bibi Zainab, she went to the grave of Rasulullah. She went to the grave of Imam Hassan. She went to the grave of Fatima al-Zahra. Allah knows what she said at the grave of her mother. My mother, what did they do to your son Abu Abdullah? What did they do to your Hussein? That same Hussein that when he was in your womb, he would say, my mother, أنا الغريب. He would say, my mother, أنا المظلوم. And he would say one line, perhaps Zainab would say to Bibi Fatima, that line, I'm going to tell you what it meant. My mother, أنا الأطشان. My mother, I'm thirsty. Oh, Fatima al-Zahra, do you know for 3 days there was no food or water, but not only that, after they butchered Hussein, 13 times they struck the neck which Rasulullah would kiss. There was no ghusl and kafan for Hussein. Allah knows the mercy that Zainab said on the grave of Fatima al-Zahra. Ajrukum ala Allah, ajrukum ala Allah. They say every day after Karbala in Medina, the Ahlul Bayt, they would have a majlis. Imam Sajjad and Bibi Zainab would commemorate this sunnah, this commemoration that we are doing. The Ahlul Bayt used to keep this commemoration and they would weep for the Ahlul Bayt. They would recite poetry and they would gather. But there came one moment in time where Abdullah ibn Ja'far al-Tayyar, the husband of Bibi Zainab, he came to Imam Sajjad and he said, oh Sajjad, tell your aunt to come home. She has not come home because Sayyidah Zainab, she stayed in the house of Imam Sajjad after Karbala, after they came back. She never went home. Allah knows why she didn't go home. Imam Sajjad came and Imam Sajjad said, my aunt Zainab, Bibi Zainab, your husband has come and he has said you have not gone home ever since you have come back from Karbala. My aunt Zainab, go home, go home. Bibi Zainab, perhaps she would have said, you are the Imam of my time. time. I'm listening to you. Zainab got up and Zainab proceeded in the neighborhood of Banu Hashim. She proceeded towards her home. Allah knows what were those thoughts. Allah knows what were those remembrances. Allah knows what she remembered. She saw the door. She saw the wall of her home. Zainab, who had not gone home. And this Zainab, who had not cried for her sons from Karbala to Kufa and Kufa to Sham, back to Karbala. She never remembered Aun and Muhammad. She remembered Aba Abdullah. She opens the door. What does she see? She sees 2 beds and she sees 2 musallas. Zainab hugs the musallas. Her heart overfilled. She said, Aun, Muhammad, my sons. I didn't cry for you, but my heart was crying. Sallallahu alayka ya Rasulullah. Sallallahu alayka ya Amir al-Mu'minin. Sallallahu alayki ya Fatimat al-Zahra, Sayyidat al-Nisa al-Alameen. Sallallahu alayka ya Hasan al-Mujtaba. Assalamu ala al-Husayn wa ala Ali ibn al-Husayn wa ala awlad al-Husayn وعلى أصحاب الحسين خصوصا سيدي ومولاي أبا الفضل العباس ابن أمير المؤمنين ماتم حسين يا حسين يا حسين
Ya Hussein, 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 Hai Sham, Sham, 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 Hai Sham. تیری امت کے زیور پہن کے تیری امت کا زیور پہن کے دیکھو نانا چلی ہوں میں شام شام ہائے شام شام ہائے شام شام ہائے شام میں دیتی کفن تجھ کو بھیا گر سر پہ ردا میرے ہوتی گر ہوتے کھلے ہاتھ میرے تیرے زخموں کو ہاتھوں سے دھوتی پابند رسن سے برہنا پابند رسن سے برہنا دیکھو بھیا چلی ہوں میں شام شام ہائے شام شام ہائے شام شام ہائے شام تیرے بچوں کو لے کر گئی میں شب بھر ساری روتی رہی ہوں کبھی غازی کا لہجہ بدل کر میں پہرے بھی دیتی رہی ہوں ان بیوہ بہو بیٹیوں سے ان بیوہ بہو بیٹیوں سے کیوں کرتے نہیں ہو کلام شام ہائے شام شام ہائے شام شام ہائے شام شام ہائے شام تیرے عابد پہ تاریخ غشی تھی اور کلثوم سہمی کھڑی تھی
کبھی دیکھوں میں زخمی سکینہ جس دامن میں آگ لگی تھی، کبھی روؤں میں اپنی رضا کو، کبھی روؤں میں اپنی رضا کو، کبھی دیکھوں میں جلتے خیام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام۔ کبھی نظریں اٹھا کر نہ دیکھا جس زینب کو تو نے برادر، پس گردن سے ہاتھ بندھے ہیں اور سر پہ نہیں میرے چادر، کیسے کوفے میں جاؤں گی غازی، کیسے کوفے میں جاؤں گی غازی، اور مجمع میں آئے گا نام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام۔ میں دیتی کفن تجھ کو بھیا گر سر پہ ردا میرے ہوتی، گر ہوتے کھلے ہاتھ میرے تیرے زخموں کو ہاتھوں سے دھوتی، پابند رسن سر پر رہنا، پابند رسن سر پر رہنا، دیکھو بھیا چلی ہوں میں شام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام۔ تیرے بچوں کو لے کر گئی میں شبر ساری روتی رہی ہوں، کبھی غازی کا لہجہ بدل کر میں پیرے بھی دیتی رہی ہوں، ان بیوہ بہو بیٹیوں سے، ان بیوہ بہو بیٹیوں سے کیوں کرتے نہیں ہو کلام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام شام، ہائے شام۔ یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین
یا حسین،
یا حسین یا حسین
یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو، 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 پام بدنا ہو آئے، ہائے پام بدنا ہو آئے، رونے پہ نہ بہرا ہو، یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو، یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو، تین جس کو نیند آتی شبیر کے سینے پر، تین جس کو نیند آتی شبیر کے سینے پر، زندان در زندان، ہائے زندان در زندان، اسی کے لیے کیسا ہو، یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو، یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو، زندانوں سے آتی تھی یاد آئے سکینے، ناز آتی تھی آواز سکنے گی، ویسے بے سکینہ کو ہے جیسے پہ سکینہ کو زندہ میں رو رہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو تکے لائے نہ وہ کیوں کر زندان کی دیواروں سے تکے لائے نہ وہ کیوں کر زندان کی دیواروں سے بائی سے اور پھوپھی سے ہر بائی سے اور پھوپھی سے سب سے کو جدا کیا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو زندان میں اے نجفی یاد آئے سکینہ کی زندان میں اے نجفی یاد آئے سکینہ کی دل رو رو کہہ رہا ہے ہائے دل رو رو کہہ رہا ہے اب نہ اجالا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو پام بند نہ ہو آئے ہائے پام بند نہ ہو آئے ریت نہ پہلا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو یا رب کوئی معصومہ زندان میرا تنہا ہو
حسین یا حسین
السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين، خصوصا سيدي ومولاي بالفضل العباس بن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا تسة المعصومين من ذرية الحسين، السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء، السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء، السلام عليك يا شمس الشموس وأنيس النفوس أيها المدفون بعرض الطوس الراضي بالقدر والقضاء ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا السلام عليك يا صاحب الأسوى الزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان، أجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك وزهورك ورحمة الله وبركاته.